This chapter in our basic tutorial section will cover what additional hardware we require for working with orchestral libraries. And we will start with what is pretty fundamental, and that is a MIDI keyboard. Here we can see an 88-key weighted master keyboard. And the question is, are 88 keys necessary? And in our opinion, they are, because when working, it is useful to use key switches. Here on the left, we can see the key switches from within the VSL plugin, and we have them set to the far left of the keyboard. There is a chapter concerning this within the tutorial. Of course, you can work with less keys than 88, but you will end up having to do a certain amount of octave switching, especially if using key switch functions. A weighted keyboard, however, whilst being useful, certainly for a pianist, is not necessary. What is important is that your keyboard has some control elements available for inputting expression parameters into your arrangements. For example, here we can see that Continuous Controller 1, or CC1, is controlling the velocity crossfade, and this is almost always routed to your modulation wheel, and almost all MIDI keyboards should have one. As you can see and hear, when moving the modulation wheel, the slider for velocity crossfade moves, and we can hear the results. As you can see, we can assign various functions to these sliders, and we can assign multiple sliders to control a variety of parameters within our plugin. The next question we have is what happens if we want to control more than one parameter simultaneously. Of course, we could assign the modulation wheel to more than one parameter, but then we move all of them at the same time. It's therefore useful to have a dedicated controller or master keyboard with multiple sliders or control elements. We have been using the Nectar Panorama P1 controller for exactly these reasons. Here we can see that the effect wet and dry balance is being controlled by MIDI CC14. And this in turn is being controlled by the first slider on my Nectar controller. And as I move it, we can hear the reverb dry-wet balance being adjusted. Of course, this can also be done from a master keyboard that has multiple sliders or knobs. You can also use a second keyboard to control elements or as an additional master keyboard. And for example, if you're using a weighted master keyboard, you may find it easier to have a second keyboard with lighter keys for playing faster passages or, for example, percussion. We also have two special cases that I'd like to point out. The first I'd like to show is for controlling wind instruments, and we have an example set up here using a clarinet from a modeling plugin. And this, of course, can be played by a keyboard. But to really add expression to a wind instrument, you can use an additional breath controller, such as the one we are using from Tech Control. When using a breath controller such as this, you define the notes on your MIDI keyboard, but the instrument will only play when you blow into the breath controller itself. In our experience, even for a beginner, this is not too complicated to learn to use. And along with this, if we use the modulation wheel from our master keyboard to add vibrato to the sound, these elements certainly enhance the realism of a wind instrument. It is also possible to use a foot controller to control modulation, for example. And this would be a useful option if both hands are used to play the musical elements. But in this case, as the instrument is monophonic, we can play it with the right hand whilst using our left hand to control the modulation wheel and our mouth to control the dynamics via the breath controller. And last but not least, I'd like to show you a specialized controller that has the disadvantage of being expensive, but offers you a lot of expression possibilities. And to show this, we have another instrument loaded. This is another modelled instrument, and it's of a trombone. And the controller I'm talking about is the Akai Iwi USB controller, which not only offers dynamics via breath control, but also, as it is laid out much like a clarinet, it can be played as an instrument in itself. It obviously requires practice, and is more useful for people who can play wind instruments in the first place. But it is clearly an exceptionally good way of controlling wind instruments in your computer. So there you have a small overview of the hardware that you will either need or wish to use when working with a virtual orchestra.